Folkloristics is the formal academic discipline devoted to the study of folklore. The term itself derives from the 19th-century German designation folkloristik. Ultimately, the term folkloristics is used to distinguish between the materials studied, folklore, and the study of folklore, folkloristics. In scholarly usage, folkloristics represents an emphasis on the contemporary, social aspects of expressive culture, in contrast to the more literary or historical study of cultural texts. Other terms that may be confused with folkloristics include the adjective folkloristik, to mean an academically oriented study, and the term folkloric, to mean materials having the character of folklore tradition. Besides, scholars specializing in folkloristics are known as folklorists. History of folklore studies. From antiquities to law, it is well documented that the term folklore was coined in 1846 by the Englishman William Thoms. He fabricated it for use in an article published in the August 22, 1846 issue of The Athenaeum. Thoms consciously replaced the contemporary terminology of popular antiquities or popular literature with this new word. Folklore was to emphasize the study of a specific subset of the population, the rural, mostly illiterate peasantry. In his published call for help in documenting antiquities, Thoms was echoing scholars from across the European continent to collect artifacts of older, mostly oral cultural traditions still flourishing among the rural populace. In Germany, the brothers Grimm had first published their Kinder und Hausmärchen in 1812. They continued throughout their lives to collect German folk tales to include in their collection. In Scandinavia, intellectuals were also searching for their authentic Teutonic roots and had labeled the studies folkminder folkermymna. Throughout Europe and America, other early collectors of folklore were at work. Thomas Crofton Croker published fairy tales from Southern Ireland and, together with his wife, documented keening and other Irish funereal customs. Elias Lonrot is best known for his collection of epic Finnish poems published under the title Kalevala. John Fanning Watson in the United States published the Annals of Philadelphia. With increasing industrialization, urbanization, and the rise in literacy throughout Europe in the 19th century, folklorists were concerned that the oral knowledge and beliefs, the lore of the rural folk, would be lost. It was posited that the stories, beliefs and customs were surviving fragments of a cultural mythology of the region, predating Christianity and rooted in pagan peoples and beliefs. This thinking goes in lockstep with the rise of nationalism across Europe. As the need to collect these vestiges of rural traditions became more compelling, the need to formalize this new field of cultural studies became apparent. The British Folklore Society was established in 1878 and the American Folklore Society was established a decade later. These were just two of a plethora of academic societies founded in the latter half of the 19th century by educated members of the emerging middle class. For literate, urban intellectuals and students of folklore, the folk was someone else and the past was recognized as being something truly different. Folklore became a measure of the progress of society, how far we had moved forward into the industrial present and indeed removed ourselves from a past marked by poverty, illiteracy and superstition. The task of both the professional folklorist and the amateur at the turn of the 20th century was to collect and classify cultural artifacts from the pre-industrial rural areas. Parallel to the drive in the life sciences to do the same for the natural world, folk was a clear label to set materials apart from modern life material specimens, which were meant to be classified in the natural history of civilization. Tales, originally dynamic and fluid, were given stability and concreteness by means of the printed page. Quote, viewed as fragments from a pre-literate culture. These stories and objects were collected without context to be displayed and studied in museums and anthologies, just as bones and potsherds were gathered for the life sciences. Carl Krohn and Antti Jahn were active collectors of folk poetry in Finland. The Scotsman Andrew Lang is known for his 25 volumes of Andrew Lang's fairy books from around the world. Francis James Child was an American academic who collected English and Scottish popular ballads and their American variants, published as the Child Ballads. In the United States, both Mark Twain and Washington Irving drew on folklore to write the stories. One Samuel Clemens was also a charter member of the American Folklore Society. Arne Thompson and the historic geographic method. By the beginning of the 20th century, these collections had grown to include artifacts from around the world and across several centuries. A system to organize and categorize them became necessary. Antti Jahn published a first classification system for folk tales in 1910. It was later expanded into the Arne Thompson classification system by Stith Thompson and remains the standard classification system for European folktales and other types of oral literature. As the number of classified artifacts grew, similarities were noted in items which had been collected from very different geographic regions, ethnic groups and epochs. In an effort to understand and explain the similarities found in tales from different locations, the Finnish folklorists Julius and Carl Krohner developed the historical geographical method, also called the Finnish method, using multiple variants of a tale. This investigative method attempted to work backwards in time and location to compile the original version from what they considered the incomplete fragments still in existence. This was the search for the form, which by definition was more complete and more authentic than the newer, more scattered versions. The historic geographic method has been succinctly described as a quantitative mining of the resulting archive, and extraction of distribution patterns in time and space. It is based on the assumption that every text artifact is a variant of the original text. As one of the major proponents of this method, Walter Anderson proposed additionally a law of self-correction, i.e. a feedback mechanism which would keep the variants closer to the original form. It was during the first decades of the 20th century that folklore studies in Europe and America began to diverge. The Europeans continued with their emphasis on oral traditions of the pre-literate peasant, and remained connected to literary scholarship within the universities. By this definition, folklore was completely based in the European cultural sphere. Any social group that did not originate in Europe was to be studied by ethnologists and cultural anthropologists. In contrast to this, American folklorists, under the influence of the German-American Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, sought to incorporate other cultural groups living in the region into the study of folklore. This included not only customs brought over by Northern European immigrants but also African Americans, Acadians of eastern Canada, Cajuns of Louisiana, Hispanics of the American Southwest, and Native Americans. Not only were these distinct cultural groups all living in the same regions, but the proximity to each other caused the traditions and customs to intermingle. The law of these distinct social groups, all of them Americans, was considered bailiwick for American folklorists, and aligned American folkloristics more with ethnology than with literary studies. Great Depression and the Federal Writers' Project. Then came the 1930s and the worldwide Great Depression. In the United States, the Federal Writers Project was established as part of the WPA. Its goal was to offer paid employment to thousands of unemployed writers by engaging them in various cultural projects around the country. These white-collar workers were sent out as field workers to collect the oral folklore of the regions, including stories, songs, idioms and dialects. The most famous of these collections is the Slave Narrative Collection. The folklore collected under the auspices of the Federal Writers Project during these years continues to offer a gold mine of primary source materials for folklorists and other cultural historians. As chairman of the Federal Writers Project between 1938 and 1942, Benjamin A. Botkin supervised the work of these folklore field workers. Both Botkin and John Lomax were particularly influential during this time in expanding folklore collection techniques to include more detailing of the interview context. This was a significant move away from viewing the collected artifacts as isolated fragments, broken remnants of an incomplete prehistoric whole. Using these new interviewing techniques, the collected lore became embedded in and imbued with meaning within the framework of its contemporary practice. The emphasis moved from the lore to the folk, i.e., the groups and the people who gave this lore meaning within contemporary daily living. Post-World War II. Following World War II, the discussion continued about whether to align folkloristics with literature or ethnology. Within this discussion, many voices were actively trying to identify the optimal approach to take in the analysis of folklore artifacts. One major change had already been initiated by Franz Boas. Culture was no longer viewed in evolutionary terms. Each culture has its own integrity and completeness, and was not progressing either toward wholeness or toward fragmentation. Individual artifacts must have meaning within the culture and for individuals themselves in order to assume cultural relevance and assure continued transmission. Because the European folklore movement had been primarily oriented toward oral traditions, a new term, folklife, was introduced to represent the full range of traditional culture. This included music, dance, storytelling, crafts, costume, foodways and more. Folklore became more than just stuff. It became a verb. Folklore was the event of doing within a given context, for a specific audience, using artifacts as necessary props in the communication of traditions between individuals and within groups. Beginning in the 1970s, these new areas of folkloristics became articulated in performance studies, where traditional behaviors are evaluated and understood within the context of the performance. It is the meaning within the social group that becomes the focus for these folklorists, foremost among them Richard Bauman and Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett. In closing, any performance is a framework which signals that the following is something outside of ordinary communication. For example, "So, have you heard the one?" automatically flags the following as a joke. A performance can take place either within a cultural group, reiterating and reinforcing the customs and beliefs of the group, or it can be performance for an outside group, in which the first goal is to set the performers apart from the audience. This analysis then goes beyond the artifact itself, be it dance, music or storytelling. It goes beyond the performers and the message. As part of performance studies, the audience becomes part of the performance. If any folklore performance strays too far from audience expectations, it will likely be brought back by means of a negative feedback loop at the next iteration. Both performer and audience are acting within the twin laws of folklore transmission, in which novelty and innovation is balanced by the conservative forces of the familiar. Even further, the presence of a folklore observer at a performance of any kind will influence the performance itself in subtle and not so subtle ways. Because folklore is firstly an active communication between parties, it is incomplete without inclusion of the reception in its analysis. The understanding of folklore performance as communication leads directly into modern linguistic theory and communication studies. Words both reflect and shape our worldview. Oral traditions, particularly in the stability over generations and even centuries, provide significant insight into the ways in which insiders of a culture see, understand, and express the responses to the world around them. Three major approaches to folklore interpretation were developed during the second half of the 20th century. Structuralism in folkloristics attempts to define the structures underlying oral and customary folklore. Once classified, it was easy for structural folklorists to lose sight of the overarching issue. What are the characteristics which keep a form constant and relevant over multiple generations? Functionalism in folkloristics also came to the fore following World War II. As spokesman, William Bascom formulated the four functions of folklore. This approach takes the more top-down approach to understand how a specific form fits into and expresses meaning within the culture as a whole. A third method of folklore analysis, popular in the late 20th century, is the psychoanalytic interpretation, championed by Alan Duns. His monographs, including a study of homoerotic subtext in American football and anal erotic elements in German folklore, were not always appreciated and involved Duns in several major folkloristic controversies during his career. True to each of these approaches, and any others one might want to employ, whichever perspective is chosen will spotlight some features and leave other characteristics in the shadows. With the passage in 1976 of the American Folklife Preservation Act, folkloristics in the United States came of age. This legislation follows in the footsteps of other legislation designed to safeguard more tangible aspects of our national heritage worthy of protection. This law also marks a shift in our national awareness. It gives voice to the national understanding that diversity within the country is a unifying feature, not something that separates us. We no longer view cultural difference as a problem to be solved, but as a tremendous opportunity. In the diversity of American folklife we find a marketplace teeming with the exchange of traditional forms and cultural ideas, a rich resource for Americans. This diversity is celebrated annually at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival and many other folklife fests around the country. Methods and areas of study. Ethnography. Folklorists use ethnographic methods to research cultures and the law. Ethnography can be divided into 5 steps: collecting the data, preserving the data, analyzing and interpreting the data, presenting the research results, advocating for the source of the data. In his essay, The Moral Law of Folklore, Henry Glassy explains that because folkloristics is crucially important, he will prescribe action for the future in what he calls a friendly manifesto. We must continue to argue over the nature of folklore and the definition of our discipline, avoiding the complacent attitudes that have enervated more established disciplines. Folklore is not simply what professional folklorists choose to study, nor is it enough to do one's private work efficiently. As we argue over what folklore is, we preserve the intrinsic value structure that has nurtured our discipline for a long time. Literary studies. On the other hand, some folklorists apply folkloristic perspectives to literary and textual analysis, so they can emphasize that folkloristics is not limited to ethnographic or sociological concerns. For example, Simon Bronner explains in his Historical Methodology in Folkloristics introduction that while he and other folklorists question the methods of the predecessors, their aim is constructive, to expand the limits of previous scholarship and to increase the maturity of folkloristics by critically looking inward and evaluate the methods of folkloristics as an academic discipline. In the book Literary Folkloristics and the Personal Narrative, Sandra Dolby-Stahl explains that calling folklore a special discipline is a subjective statement, but the purpose of her book is to show what a trained folklorist finds so very appealing about the field of folklore study, and she concludes that hearing tradition in personal narratives is a professional response made possible through a literary folkloristic methodology. Usage. In spite of some continuing resistance to the term folkloristics, it is the preferred term of the field and has even been used by folklorists in academic institutions for more than 100 years. In fact, international developments have drawn attention to the term folkloristics since the beginning of the 20th century, including the establishment of a permanent professorial chair in folkloristics at the University of Helsinki in 1908 and the creation of one department of folkloristics at the University of Tartu in 1919 and another at the Estonian Literary Museum in 1990. Some scholars still use the terms folklore studies or folklife research to describe folkloristics because of the interdisciplinary, humanistic and social science approaches used to analyze folklore. However, folkloristics remains the preferred term in academic folklore circles, scholarly organizations and journals. Important people. Key terms. Arne Thompson classification system. Motif. Artifact. Assemblage. Ethnography. Folklore categories. Customary law, material law, and verbal law. Legend. Rite of passage. Morphology. Proverb. Folk groups. Mormon folklore, Germanic folklore, Czech folklore, folklore of the United States, French folklore, Italian folklore, Japanese folklore, Chinese folklore, associated theories and methods, environmental determinism, ethnology, ethnopoetics, a method of recording text versions of oral poetry and narrative performances. Functionalism, mimesis, performance studies, regimes of value, romantic nationalism, social evolution, structuralism,